"Get your dog away from my fence." The angry shout from John Johnson shattered the morning quiet as his neighbor Robert Miller simply walked his golden retriever past the property line they'd been fighting over for a decade. Elvis, who was visiting a friend nearby, stopped cold when he heard the venom in that voice. What he was about to uncover would prove that 10 years of hatred had been built on the smallest, most ridiculous misunderstanding in Memphis history. But to understand how a $20 garden tool could destroy 2 families and divide an entire neighborhood, we need to go back 3 days, to when Elvis first arrived on Elm Street to visit his old friend Charlie Hodge. The silence between houses 247 and 249 was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Elvis had noticed it immediately: 2 families living side by side who acted like the other didn't exist. No morning greetings over coffee, no children playing together in the yards, no shared conversations across the fence that separated their properties like a concrete wall of pride. "Been going on 10 years now," Charlie had explained as they sat on his porch that December afternoon. "Used to be best friends, those 2 families. John Johnson and Robert Miller served together in Korea, came home and bought houses right next to each other on purpose. Their wives Mary and Sarah were like sisters. Kids grew up together like cousins." Elvis shook his head. "What broke them apart? Garden tool went missing. Each family blames the other. Pride built walls higher than any fence ever could." Now, watching the confrontation unfold in front of him, Elvis saw exactly what Charlie meant. John Johnson stood on his front porch in his work clothes, his face red with a decade of accumulated anger. Robert Miller hadn't even paused in his walk, but his shoulders were tense, his golden retriever Buddy sensing the hostility and pulling toward home. "I'm on the public sidewalk, John," Robert called back quietly, his voice carrying the weariness of a man tired of fighting the same battle every day. "Don't you John me. You know exactly what you did." "I know what you think I did." The words hung in the cold December air like smoke from a gun. Elvis watched as Robert hurried past, his dog practically dragging him toward the safety of their own yard. Behind the Johnson house's front window, a woman's silhouette appeared, Mary Johnson, also watching, also hurting. After 10 years of lost friendship, that's when Elvis made his decision. He'd seen enough broken relationships in his life to know that some wounds festered if left untreated. But he'd also learned that sometimes an outside perspective could see what people too close to the problem couldn't. He knocked on the Johnson door first. John answered, still breathing hard from his outburst. When he saw Elvis Presley standing on his doorstep, his expression shifted from anger to shock to embarrassment in the span of 3 seconds. "Mr. Presley, what in the world? How can I help you?" "Evening, John. Couldn't help but overhear the conversation with your neighbor. Mind if I come in? I'd like to understand what's really going on here." John's living room reflected his military background, neat, sparse, functional. Photos from his service in Korea lined the mantel, and Elvis was surprised to see several that showed John and Robert Miller in uniform, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera like brothers who'd been through hell together and survived. "We were closer than blood," John said, noticing Elvis's gaze. "Saved each other's lives more than once over there. When we came back home, we swore nothing would ever come between us. Guess we were wrong about that." Mary Johnson emerged from the kitchen, a small woman with kind eyes that carried too much sadness. "Mr. Presley, I'm Mary, John's wife. I apologize for the shouting. It's just, this situation has been eating at us for so long." Elvis stood and shook her hand gently. "Please call me Elvis. And don't apologize. I understand you and the Miller family used to be close." Mary's eyes immediately filled with tears. "Sarah Miller was my best friend for 15 years. We did everything together, cooked, cleaned, raised our children, shared our hopes and fears. Our kids called us Aunt Mary and Aunt Sarah. We were family in every way except blood." "Then what happened?" Elvis asked, settling into the offered chair. John's jaw tightened like a steel trap. "Robert Miller stole my rototiller. Brand new machine I'd saved up 6 months to buy. Cost me nearly $1,000, which was a fortune back in 1965. Asked to borrow it for one day to prep his garden, and it vanished like smoke. He didn't steal anything, John, Mary said quietly. Clearly an argument they'd repeated hundreds of times. Something happened to it, yes, but Robert would never. Then where is it, Mary? 10 years later, where's my rototiller? Elvis held up his hands diplomatically. Tell me exactly what happened that day, step by step. John sat heavily in his recliner, the anger replaced by weariness. May 15, 1965. A date burned into my memory forever. I was working the night shift at Ford, so I wasn't home during the day. Robert came by around 6 in the morning, asked Mary if he could borrow the rototiller to turn his garden soil for spring planting. Mary said yes, we'd always shared tools with each other. Robert said he'd have it back by evening. And evening came. No Robert, no rototiller. Next morning I went over to ask about it. Sarah answered the door, said Robert was at work, looked nervous as a cat, told me she was sure he'd bring it back soon. Waited 2 more days, then went back. This time Robert answered, cool as you please, said he'd already returned it. But it wasn't in your garage. Searched everywhere, high and low, asked every neighbor on the street if they'd seen it. Nothing. Machine had disappeared completely. Mary spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. I tried calling Sarah the next day to talk about it, woman to woman. She wouldn't come to the phone. When I went over in person, she acted like I was accusing her family of being thieves. Maybe she felt defensive, Elvis suggested gently. Maybe she felt guilty, John snapped. Because they were thieves. Elvis could see the pain behind the anger. This wasn't just about money or a missing machine. This was about trust broken, friendship betrayed, and pride wounded so deeply that 10 years hadn't healed it. Would you mind if I talked to the Millers too? Heard their side of the story. John shrugged. Won't change anything. But go ahead. Just don't expect them to tell you the truth. 20 minutes later, Elvis was sitting in the Miller family's warm kitchen, surrounded by the scent of fresh-baked bread and the sound of children doing homework upstairs. Robert Miller was a tall, gentle man with dirt under his fingernails and kind eyes that matched his wife's. Sarah Miller had the same warm demeanor Mary Johnson once had, but both carried the weight of a decade-long burden. Presley, Robert began before Elvis even asked a question. I don't know what John told you, but I swear on my children's lives and my mother's grave, I returned that rototiller exactly where I found it. Tell me what you remember about that day. Robert ran his weathered hands through his thinning hair. May 15th, 1965. How could I forget? Got up early, around 5:30, to work in the garden before the heat got bad. Walked over to John's garage. He was still sleeping after working nights. The rototiller was right there in the back corner where he always kept it. Used it all day, cleaned it up good, and wheeled it back to his garage around 7 that evening. Sarah nodded emphatically. I saw him do it. I was washing dinner dishes and watched through the kitchen window. Robert put that machine back exactly where he'd found it, cleaned it off, even checked the oil level like John always did. But when John looked for it the next day, it wasn't there, so he claimed. Robert said, frustration evident in his voice. But I put it back. Sarah saw me put it back. We're not liars, Mr. Presley. Elvis studied both their faces. Then what do you think happened to it? Robert shrugged helplessly. Could have been stolen from John's garage later that night. Could be John forgot where he kept it and looked in the wrong place. Could be a dozen things. All I know is I returned it in perfect condition. Why didn't you go over and help him look for it when he couldn't find it? Sarah's voice cracked with emotion. We tried. The morning after John claimed it was missing, I went over to Mary's like I had every morning for 15 years. Just wanted to have coffee and figure out what happened. She wouldn't even open the door, just yelled through it that decent people didn't associate with thieves. That must have been devastating. Destroyed our world, Sarah whispered. Mary had been my sister in every way that mattered. Our children were best friends. We shared everything, joys, sorrows, hopes, fears. Then suddenly we were criminals in her eyes. Robert's hands clenched into fists. 15 years of friendship gone over a machine, I returned. We became pariahs on our own street. People choosing sides. Kids forbidden from playing together. All because John Johnson decided we were thieves instead of friends. Elvis spent the next hour listening to stories about the friendship that had been destroyed. Birthday parties where both families celebrated together. Holiday dinners that alternated between houses. Late-night phone calls when someone was sick or troubled. A community of love and support that had been shattered by suspicion and pride. But something bothered Elvis about the whole situation. Both families struck him as fundamentally honest people. John Johnson wasn't a liar, and neither was Robert Miller. Military men had a code of honor that didn't easily break. So what really happened to that rototiller? The next morning, Elvis began his own quiet investigation. He walked through the neighborhood, talking to longtime residents, asking casual questions about the old days on Elm Street. Most people remembered the Johnson-Miller feud, but nobody had any concrete information about the missing machine. Then he knocked on Frank Henderson's door. Henderson was a retired mechanic in his early 70s, who lived 3 houses down from the feuding families. When Elvis mentioned he was asking around about old neighborhood stories, Henderson invited him in for coffee, and seemed eager to talk. Elm Street used to be like one big family, Henderson said, settling into his worn armchair. Everybody looked out for everybody else. Kids played in all the yards. Women shared recipes and watched each other's children. Men helped with home repairs and borrowed tools freely. I understand the Johnson and Miller families were particularly close. Henderson's expression darkened. Thick as thieves, those 2 families. Then they became just thieves, if you ask John Johnson. You remember the rototiller incident. Henderson was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup like he was reading tea leaves. Why you asking about ancient history, Mr. Presley? Those 2 families have been destroying each other for 10 years over something that might have been a simple misunderstanding. I'm trying to figure out what really happened. Henderson set down his cup with shaking hands. What if I told you I knew exactly what happened to that rototiller? Elvis felt his pulse quicken. I'd say I'm listening. Henderson was quiet for another long moment, then stood up slowly. Come with me to the garage. The garage was filled with tools, spare parts and decades of mechanical projects. In the back corner, covered by a dusty tarp, and surrounded by boxes, sat a red rototiller with Johnson painted in white letters on the side. Elvis stared at it in complete shock. Frank, how long has this been here? 10 years, 3 months and 12 days, Henderson replied, his voice thick with shame. I've counted every one of them. Tell me what happened. Henderson collapsed onto a nearby workbench, suddenly looking every one of his 73 years. May 15, 1965. Late that evening, maybe 9:30 or 10 o'clock. I was working on a project in my own garage, needed a rototiller to prep a patch of ground the next morning for my wife Rose's flower garden. Walked over to see if John would lend me his machine. Elvis waited, sensing there was much more to this story. John wasn't home yet, still at the plant working his shift. But his garage door was open like always, and I could see the rototiller sitting right there in the back corner where Robert had put it after borrowing it that day. Figured I'd just take it for a few hours and have it back before John even knew it was gone. But you didn't return it. Henderson's voice broke completely.
Rose had a massive heart attack the next morning.
Massive. Spent 3 months in the hospital fighting for her life, then 6 months at home recovering. I completely forgot about the rototiller. By the time I remembered, must have been 4 months later, I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that John and Robert were feuding about it. Why didn't you speak up then?
Because I was a coward,
Henderson said bitterly. I was embarrassed, ashamed. How do you tell 2 families that you accidentally destroyed their friendship over your own thoughtless mistake? I kept thinking they'd work it out on their own, make up like friends do. But they never did. They never did. And every day for 10 years, I've watched those 2 families hate each other over something I did. Watched their children grow up as strangers instead of friends, watched their wives pass each other on the street like enemies. All because I was too proud and too ashamed to admit what I'd done. Elvis looked at the dusty machine that had caused so much unnecessary pain. A $20 piece of equipment that had cost two families their friendship, their children, their playmates, their wives, their sisterhood. Frank, you have to tell them the truth. They'll never forgive me. John will probably want to kill me. Robert will hate me for letting him be blamed all these years. Maybe, but living with this lie is eating you alive, and it's destroying innocent people. You have to make it right. Henderson stared at the rototiller like it was a poisonous snake. How do I tell them after all this time? We do it together. Today, right now. That afternoon, Elvis orchestrated what he privately called the Great Rototiller Revelation. He asked Charlie Hodge to help him gather both families on the sidewalk between their houses, telling each family separately that he had discovered important information about their 10-year dispute. When John and Mary Johnson emerged from their house at the same time Robert and Sarah Miller came out of theirs, the tension was immediately thick enough to cut with a knife. They hadn't been this close to each other in years. "What's this about, Elvis?" John asked warily, his eyes never leaving his former best friend's face. "I've been investigating your missing rototiller," Elvis said simply. "Found some information I think you all need to hear." Robert and Sarah exchanged nervous glances. John crossed his arms defensively, while Mary looked like she might be sick. "Found the machine. Found the truth." At that moment, Frank Henderson appeared at the end of the street, pushing the red rototiller ahead of him like a man walking to his own execution. When John saw his machine, his name still painted in white letters on the side, his mouth fell open in complete shock. "Frank, what? How did you get my rototiller?" Henderson stopped directly between the two families, his face pale but determined. "It's been in my garage for 10 years, John, and I owe all of you an apology that should have been made a decade ago." For the next 20 minutes, Henderson told his story while four neighbors who hadn't spoken in 10 years listened in stunned silence. He explained about Rose's heart attack, about his embarrassment and shame, about watching their friendship die while being too cowardly to prevent it. When he finished, nobody spoke for what felt like an eternity. The weight of 10 years of wasted friendship, missed birthdays, holiday celebrations spent in silence, and children who grew up as strangers hung heavy in the December air. Finally, John Johnson broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. "So Robert, you really did return it that night." "I told you I did. John, I never lied to you." "And Sarah, when you said you saw him put it back?" "I saw him clean it, and put it exactly where you kept it. I never lied either." John turned to face his former best friend directly for the first time in a decade. "Robert, God Almighty, what have we done? Wasted 10 years hating each other over nothing." Robert replied quietly, "I called you a thief. I turned the whole neighborhood against you. I made your children outcasts because of my pride. I called you a liar behind your back, said you were crazy for forgetting where you put your own machine. I hated you for ruining our friendship." Mary Johnson stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "Sarah, I said such horrible things to you, about you. I poisoned people against your family because I thought." Sarah Miller looked at her former best friend, the woman who had been like a sister for 15 years before becoming like a stranger for 10. "We both said horrible things, Mary. We both chose pride over love." Without another word, Sarah stepped forward and pulled Mary into a hug that had been 10 years in the making. Both women sobbed openly as they held each other, a decade of pain and loneliness flowing out in tears. The men were slower to reconcile, their pride more stubborn, their anger more deeply rooted. But when John extended a trembling hand to Robert, the Korean War veteran who had once been his brother in arms broke down completely. "I missed you, Robert. I missed my friend. I missed you too, John." Every single day, they embraced like the soldiers they'd once been, like the friends they should have remained. like the brothers they were meant to be. Frank Henderson stood watching, tears streaming down his own weathered cheeks. "Can you ever forgive a foolish old man?" John looked at him for a long moment, then walked over and put his hand on Henderson's shoulder. "Frank, you made a mistake. We all make mistakes. But Robert and we chose to let pride and stubbornness destroy something beautiful. That's on us, not you." Robert nodded in agreement. "You should have told us 10 years ago, but we should have talked to each other instead of making assumptions. We're all responsible for this mess." But Elvis wasn't finished with his intervention. "You know what this neighborhood needs," he said, as the families continued their emotional reunion. "A proper celebration. It's almost Christmas, and you folks have 10 years of holidays to make up for." 3 days later, on Christmas Eve, Elvis organized the most magnificent block party Elm Street had ever seen. He brought his guitar, several members of his band, and enough food to feed the entire neighborhood. The Johnson and Miller families co-hosted the event, working together like they'd never been apart. Elvis watched with deep satisfaction as John and Robert worked side by side hanging Christmas lights, their children, now teenagers, getting to know each other for the first time. Mary and Sarah bustled around the kitchen planning the menu, finishing each other's sentences like they had 15 years earlier. As the evening wound down and neighbors began to head home, John Johnson approached Elvis. "How do we thank you for giving us back our lives?" Elvis looked around at the neighborhood coming alive again, families laughing together, former enemies now friends. "You don't thank me, John. You remember this feeling next time you're tempted to let pride get in the way of love, and you pass that lesson along to your children. What made you care so much about our problems?" Elvis was quiet for a moment, watching Mary and Sarah clean up together, chattering like teenagers. "I've learned that fame and money don't mean much if you don't have people who love you. You folks had something precious, real friendship, real community, and you nearly threw it away over a misunderstanding. Seemed like something worth saving." The Christmas Eve party became an annual tradition on Elm Street. Every year the Johnson and Miller families would co-host, and every year Frank Henderson would tell the story of his mistake, and how Elvis Presley helped heal the wounds it created. Henderson kept John's rototiller in perfect working condition, and used it to maintain gardens for elderly neighbors who could no longer handle the heavy work themselves. When John finally decided he was too old for gardening, he officially gave the machine to Frank. "You've had it longer than I ever did," John said with a laugh. "And you've put it to better use. Keep it." The impact of that Christmas Eve reconciliation rippled through the entire Memphis community. The story spread through churches, community groups, and local newspapers. Other neighbors began reaching out to people they'd lost touch with over minor disagreements. The local Methodist church started a reconciliation Sunday service, where people could make amends for old grievances. But perhaps the most beautiful outcome was watching the children. The Johnson and Miller kids, who had spent their early years forbidden from playing together, became inseparable. Mary's daughter Lisa and Sarah's son David started dating in high school, and eventually married, making the two families officially related. At their wedding reception, they asked Elvis to sing, and he performed "Love Me Tender" while two families who had once been enemies sat together as one large loving clan. "If you hadn't helped our parents forgive each other," Lisa said in her wedding speech, "David and I never would have had the chance to fall in love." Sometimes God uses the most unexpected angels to heal the deepest wounds. Years later, when Elvis would reflect on his career and legacy, he often thought about that December week on Elm Street. Not about the concerts or the records or the fame, but about two families who rediscovered love, two children who grew up to marry each other, and a neighborhood that learned to forgive. The Henderson rototiller incident, as it came to be known locally, became a parable about the power of truth, the danger of assumptions, and the importance of choosing love over pride. It was taught in Sunday school classes, referenced in marriage counseling sessions, and retold whenever communities faced division. And every Christmas Eve on a quiet street in Memphis, two families still gather to celebrate not just the birth of Christ, but the rebirth of friendship. They tell the story of how a $20 garden tool nearly destroyed them, and how Elvis Presley helped them find their way back to each other. Because sometimes the most important thing a person can do isn't entertain the world, but heal a single neighborhood. Sometimes the greatest performance isn't on a stage, but in someone's front yard. And sometimes the most lasting legacy isn't in the history books, but in the hearts of people who learned to love again. The psychological impact of that December reconciliation extended far beyond the immediate participants. Margaret Chen, a family therapist who had been following community dynamics in Memphis neighborhoods, documented what she called the Henderson effect, the phenomenon of how one person's courage to tell the truth could heal multiple relationships simultaneously. What we witnessed on Elm Street, Dr. Chen wrote in her landmark study, was a perfect example of how pride and assumptions can destroy even the strongest bonds, and how truth-telling, no matter how delayed, can restore them. The Elvis factor, having a trusted neutral party facilitate the revelation, was crucial to the healing process. The study became required reading in conflict resolution courses across the country. Marriage counselors began using the rototiller method to help couples identify their own missing tools, the small misunderstandings that had grown into massive relationship barriers. Frank Henderson, who had lived with shame for a decade, became an unlikely local hero. His willingness to finally confess inspired dozens of other Memphis residents to come forward with their own long-held secrets that had damaged relationships. A support group formed at the local Methodist church called Truth Tellers Anonymous, where people could practice confession in a safe environment before making amends to those they had wronged. Henderson himself became the group's most effective counselor. "I wasted 10 years being too proud to admit a simple mistake," he would tell newcomers. "Don't let pride cost you what these folks almost lost forever." The economic impact on Elm Street was measurable as well. Property values increased by 30% within 2 years as word spread about the neighborhood that healed itself. Families specifically sought out homes on streets where the Henderson story had taken place, hoping to find that same sense of community connection. Local businesses took notice too. Memphis hardware stores began hosting tool lending libraries where neighbors could borrow equipment without the risk of misunderstandings. Each tool came with a detailed checkout system and return protocol, dubbed Henderson rules by staff and customers alike. The Johnson and Miller grandchildren, who grew up hearing the story of their grandparents' reconciliation, developed what family members called Henderson syndrome, an almost compulsive need to resolve conflicts immediately rather than let them fester. Lisa Johnson Miller and David Miller Johnson, they hyphenated their names to honor both families, raised their children with the Elm Street rules. Rule 1. Never assume the worst about people you love. Rule 2. Ask questions before making accusations. Rule 3. Pride is more dangerous than any enemy. Rule 4. Truth-telling is harder than truth-hiding but always worth it. Rule 5. Forgiveness is a choice, not a feeling. These rules were written on a plaque that hung in their kitchen, and copies were requested by so many visitors that the family had them professionally printed and distributed them free at community events. The annual Christmas Eve celebration on Elm Street grew from a single block party to a city-wide tradition. The Elvis Peace Prize was established by the Memphis City Council, awarded annually to individuals who demonstrated exceptional conflict resolution in their communities. Recipients received a small golden rototiller trophy and the opportunity to tell their story at the Christmas Eve celebration. Elvis himself returned to Elm Street every few years to check on his peace project, as he privately called it. He was amazed to see how the reconciliation had created lasting change not just for the Johnson and Miller families, but for the entire community's approach to conflict. "You know," John Johnson told Elvis during one of these visits, "that rototiller taught us more about human nature than any preacher or teacher ever did. It showed us how easy it is to destroy something beautiful over nothing and how hard it is to rebuild once trust is broken. But you did rebuild, Elvis pointed out. With help, couldn't have done it alone. Sometimes you need someone from outside the situation to see what people on the inside can't see. This observation led to the establishment of the Elvis mediation method in Memphis family courts. Trained mediators used the Henderson case study to help feuding families identify their own missing rototillers, the small incidents that had been blown out of proportion and allowed to destroy relationships. Judge Patricia Williams, who pioneered the program, reported an 85% success rate in family reconciliation cases where the Elvis method was employed. The key, she explained, is helping people separate the incident from their assumptions about the incident. Often, like with the Henderson case, the facts are completely different from what the parties believe. The method spread to other cities, then other states, then internationally. The University of Memphis established the Henderson Institute for Community Reconciliation, which offered certification programs for mediators specializing in neighborhood and family conflicts. Sarah Miller, who had become a passionate advocate for community healing after her own experience, served as the Institute's first director. When you've experienced the pain of losing someone you love over a misunderstanding, she said, in her inaugural address, you'll do anything to prevent others from going through the same heartbreak. The Institute developed a comprehensive curriculum based on the Elm Street case study, examining every aspect of how the conflict began, escalated, was resolved, and created lasting change. Students came from around the world to study what became known as the Memphis Model for Community Reconciliation. Mary Johnson, despite having no formal education in psychology or social work, became one of the Institute's most requested speakers. Her presentation, Living with the Enemy Next Door, drew standing ovations and consistently rated as the most impactful session in the program. For 10 years she would tell audiences, I had the opportunity every single day to simply walk next door and ask Sarah what really happened. But I was too proud, too hurt, too convinced I was right. I chose being right over being happy. I chose pride over love. Don't make that choice. The theological implications of the Henderson story weren't lost on religious communities either. Memphis churches began incorporating the rototiller parable into their teaching about forgiveness, reconciliation, and the dangers of judgment. The story perfectly illustrated Jesus' teaching about removing the plank from your own eye before pointing out the speck in your brother's. Several denominations rewrote their conflict resolution protocols based on lessons learned from Elm Street. The Southern Baptist Convention published the Henderson Principles as a guide for church mediation, while the Catholic Diocese of Memphis established a Truth and Reconciliation program modeled after the support group Frank Henderson had inspired. Rabbi David Goldstein of Temple Beth Sholom used the story in his Yom Kippur sermons about atonement and making amends. Frank Henderson waited 10 years to tell the truth, he would say. How long are we waiting? What truths are we holding back that could heal our relationships if we had the courage to speak them? The interfaith community in Memphis adopted the annual Christmas Eve celebration as an official city event, with leaders from all major religious traditions participating. It became a symbol of how people of different backgrounds could come together around shared values of truth, forgiveness, and community healing. Corporate America took notice as well. Major companies began studying the Henderson case as an example of how small workplace misunderstandings could escalate into major organizational problems if not addressed promptly and transparently. Human resources departments developed Henderson protocols for investigating workplace conflicts and ensuring that all parties were heard before conclusions were drawn. The Harvard Business School published a case study titled The Rototiller Revolution: How One Man's Truth Transformed a Community, which became required reading in organizational behavior courses. MBA students analyzed how pride, assumptions, and communication breakdowns could destroy even the strongest professional relationships. International peace organizations took note as well. The United Nations invited Sarah Miller and Mary Johnson to speak at a conference on community-based reconciliation programs. Their presentation, from neighbors to enemies to family, a decade of conflict and one day of truth, was translated into 47 languages and used in post-conflict societies around the world. The scale doesn't matter, Sarah told the UN audience. Whether it's two families or two nations, the principles are the same. Pride destroys, assumptions mislead, and truth heals. But someone has to be brave enough to speak that truth, even when it's difficult. The Henderson story became a case study in sociology programs examining how individual actions can create ripple effects throughout entire communities. Professor James Morrison of Memphis State University spent 15 years documenting the long-term social changes that resulted from that single December confrontation. His findings were remarkable. Divorce rates in the Elm Street neighborhood dropped by 60% compared to similar Memphis communities. Property crime decreased by 45%. School performance improved as children learned conflict resolution skills at home. Mental health professionals reported fewer anxiety and depression cases from the area. What we documented, Professor Morrison explained, was how healing one relationship can strengthen an entire social network. The Johnson-Miller reconciliation gave everyone in the community permission to address their own unresolved conflicts. It created a culture where truth-telling and forgiveness were valued more highly than being right. The children who grew up on Elm Street during the healing years developed what researchers called Henderson resilience, an unusual ability to navigate conflict without allowing it to destroy relationships. As adults, they had lower divorce rates, stronger friendships, better job performance, and higher life satisfaction scores than their peers from other neighborhoods. Lisa and David's children, the third generation affected by the rototiller incident, became passionate advocates for truth and reconciliation in their own adult lives. Their oldest son, Frank Henderson Johnson Miller, named after the man whose courage had made their family possible, became a professional mediator specializing in family conflicts. Grandpa John and Grandpa Robert taught me that loving someone means being willing to be wrong about them. Frank Jr. explained during his graduation speech from mediation training. Great Uncle Frank taught me that telling the truth, even when it's hard, is the only way to live with yourself. And Elvis taught all of us that sometimes the most important thing you can do is help other people find their way back to love. The Memphis tourism industry eventually incorporated the Henderson story into their city tours. The reconciliation route took visitors past the famous houses on Elm Street, the Methodist Church where Truth Tellers Anonymous still met, and the Henderson Institute for Community Reconciliation. Tour guides would explain how one man's mistake and another man's compassion had transformed an entire city's approach to conflict resolution. Elvis memorabilia collectors began seeking items connected to the Elm Street intervention, though few existed since Elvis had deliberately kept his role low-key. The only documented artifact was a photograph taken at the Christmas Eve celebration showing Elvis with both families, all laughing together around the infamous rototiller which Frank Henderson had decorated with Christmas lights for the occasion. That photograph, displayed in the lobby of the Henderson Institute, bore a simple caption: "Sometimes the smallest truths create the biggest healings." The medical community found applications for the Henderson model as well. Hospitals dealing with family conflicts during end-of-life care began using modified versions of the Elvis mediation method to help relatives work through old grievances before it was too late. Dr. Patricia Martinez, who pioneered the medical application, explained families often come to hospitals carrying years of unresolved conflicts, just like the Johnsons and Millers. When someone is dying, these old wounds can prevent family members from being present for each other. The Henderson approach helps them identify the missing rototillers in their relationships and address them while there's still time. The success rate was remarkable. Families who participated in Henderson-style mediation sessions were 80% more likely to reconcile before their loved one's death, leading to better grief processing and fewer long-term family fractures. Mental health professionals adapted the model for treating families affected by addiction, trauma, and other crisis situations. The Henderson questions became a standard tool for therapists. What do you assume happened? What do you know for certain happened? What questions haven't you asked? What are you afraid to learn? What would you need to hear to forgive? These questions, simple as they seemed, consistently helped clients identify the difference between facts and assumptions, opening pathways to healing that had seemed impossible. The educational impact was significant as well. Schools throughout Tennessee began teaching Henderson lessons in their conflict resolution curricula. Elementary students learned to ask, "What's the real story?" before making assumptions about classmates. Middle schoolers practiced truth-telling and apology-making. High schoolers studied the long-term consequences of pride versus forgiveness. Bullying incidents decreased dramatically in schools that implemented Henderson programming. Students who learned to question their assumptions and seek truth rather than revenge created safer, more compassionate learning environments for everyone. Teacher Sarah Beth Williams, who developed the elementary curriculum, explained children are naturally curious about truth. They want to understand why things happen. The Henderson story gives them a framework for investigating conflicts rather than just reacting to them. They learn that the first explanation isn't always the right explanation. College campuses began hosting Henderson Weeks annually, focusing on campus unity and conflict resolution. These events, typically scheduled during the stressful period before final exams, provided students with tools for managing academic and social pressures without destroying relationships. The University of Memphis, where the Henderson Institute was located, reported a 30% decrease in honor code violations after implementing Henderson principles. Students were more likely to admit mistakes early, seek help when struggling, and resolve conflicts through conversation rather than retaliation. The Henderson story teaches students that admitting error is actually a sign of strength, not weakness, explained Dean of Students Michael Rodriguez. When students see that telling the truth, even painful truth, can heal rather than destroy relationships, they're more willing to be honest about their own struggles and mistakes. As decades passed, the Henderson rototiller incident became woven into the cultural fabric of Memphis. Children grew up knowing the story. Couples referenced it during premarital counseling. Community leaders cited it when addressing public conflicts. It became shorthand for the idea that most problems were smaller than they seemed, but pride could make them bigger than necessary. Frank Henderson lived to see his 89th birthday, surrounded by the Johnson and Miller families who had become his own adopted clan. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by his courage to finally tell the truth. The eulogy was delivered by John Johnson and Robert Miller together, two old soldiers saying goodbye to the man whose mistake had nearly destroyed them, and whose honesty had ultimately saved them. "Frank taught us that we're all human," John said. "We all make mistakes. But some of us learn to tell the truth about our mistakes, and some of us spend our lives hiding from them. Frank chose truth, even when it was hard, even when he was scared, even when he thought we might never forgive him." Robert continued, "The rototiller is still in Frank's garage, still works perfectly, still gets used to help neighbors who need it. Frank turned his mistake into a tool for serving others. That's the kind of man we should all try to be." Elvis, though unable to attend the funeral due to his own declining health, sent a floral arrangement shaped like a rototiller with a note that read, "To Frank, thank you for teaching us all that truth is the most important tool in any garage. Your friend Elvis." The Henderson legacy continued through the Institute, the annual celebrations, the countless families who had learned to choose truth over pride, and the children who grew up in a community that valued honesty and forgiveness above being right. And every Christmas Eve, on a quiet street in Memphis, two families still gather with their neighbors to tell the story of how a $20 garden tool nearly destroyed them, how one man's courage to tell the truth saved them, and how Elvis Presley helped them remember that love is always stronger than pride. The final count: one small mistake, 10 years of pain, one moment of courage, and a lifetime of healing that touched thousands of lives and continues to ripple outward, proving that sometimes the most important performance isn't on a stage in Vegas, but in someone's front yard in Memphis, where broken hearts can learn to love again.